So just as a teaser, just a few keywords. I will talk about cultural evolution, and well, my talk can be taken to be an illustration of Nicolas Cladier's talk about the role of promiscuous causality in cultural evolution. Yeah, thank you. So I will talk about the role, in particular, of representations with normative content or normative implications in the evolution of culture, and I will also talk about the role of institutions in the evolution of culture. So keywords: cultural evolution, institutions, and promiscuous causality of representations with normative content. So this is a plan of my talk. So I will talk about a framework in cognition and culture, which I think is very important and about which we didn't talk until now, which is the theory of distributed cognition. I think this theory is pretty successful and widely used among anthropologists. So I have a brief reminder about the theory, and I will ask about the evolution of distributed cognitive systems, then using the epidemiology of representation. Then I will give a course in mathematics, and I will prove a theorem that took 1 century and a half to prove, and that takes about 20 pages. And third, I will analyze the history in terms of the evolution of distributed cognitive systems, emphasizing these 3 points about how one distributes the cognitive effort, ascription of cognitive function, that is specific representations that describe cognitive function. These are the representations with promiscuous causal power, and then about the institutional aspects of this history. Okay, so what about distributed cognition? The idea of distributed cognition is that processing information, processing a representation is not done only within the mind. It is done also using the environment, and it may span different people. So the archetypical example of distributed cognition is addition of large number or multiplication, where you have this routine of writing down the numbers. So you need pen and paper, first of all. And there is this action of writing down the numbers in a specific arrangement. And then I won't do it for, and then you proceed with your multiplication table, and you have specific rules. Using the environment, you have to put the results, you have to write the carry, and so on. So this is the archetypical example of distributed or situated cognition. Situated cognition is more related with using the environment in cognition, while distributed cognition argues that cognition can also be distributed among individuals. And here the seminal work is the one of Hutchins, who talked about navigation. So he explains that in a boat, there is a group of people and their tools. And these people have their duties, their own duties, their cognitive tasks, and they share they distribute the task so as to produce the eventual output of navigation, which is to put a point of a map. So there is an output, which is a point of a map, a representation of the location of the boat, and there is a large cognitive system that involves 2 sailors at each corner of a boat, looking, communicating, using tools. So the chart, for instance, specific rulers. One important remark that proponents of distributed cognition and situated cognition do is that the distribution of cognition opens new computational possibilities. That is, it is not just a question of time or just a question of power of memory, but that we can really do things together or with tools that we can't do alone. So it's like carrying something really, really heavy. We can't do it alone, but maybe if we are several people, we can do it. And it is the same with cognition. There are things that we can do together, but that we can't do alone. So distributing cognition gives us some more cognitive power. It's not only quantitative, but also qualitative. Just another point. In passing, I think that mathematics is the best case of distributed cognition. The idea that we have generally is about the lonely mathematicians who only think on his own and who does not rely on artifacts or other individuals. As a matter of fact, mathematics is very distributed, and this example is a proof of it. In fact, proofs themselves are distributed. They are the same as this operation of multiplying. We have to write down lines, and then we use the line of a proof in order to go to the next step, and so on. Okay, and historically also, mathematics happen to be, counting happens to be one of the first use of externally terms for cognition. So my question is, which are the principles through which distributed cognitive systems are maintained in time and evolved? The point is that the analysis that have been done by proponents of distributed and situated cognition have mainly focused on the functional systems of distributed cognitive distributed cognition, without giving a good explanation, or without giving any explanation of how cognition comes to be distributed the way it is, how we come to use the environment. So one first thing to notice is that in fact distributed cognition is just some kind of causal, cognitive causal chain. These are, as you noticed with the addition, you have a mental representation, you produce a public representation, then the public representation is used by the mental representation, and so on. So they are tight interactions and cultural and causal cognitive chain. In the case of navigation, it is also described as types of cognitive causal chain, where the sailor is producing a representation with what he sees. He communicates his representation, which is then processed by further on by further sailors or other chiefs. One particular thing that needs to be explained in distributed cognitive systems is the application of rules or routines in the production of representation. And what happens, so I'm talking about the specificity of those cognitive causal chains. So these are not, they have some particularity. They consist in applying some rules or routines in the production of representation, and they deal with types of cognitive problems. So adding, multiplying, or finding the location of the code. And in the end, they constitute cognitive functional entities. So the idea is that in order to understand this systematicity, how it happens, in order to give a causal explanation of the properties of this causal cognitive causal chain that constitutes distributed cognitive system, we need to zoom out in order to see in which cultural cognitive causal chain these cognitive causal chain that constitute distributed cognitive systems are embedded. Okay? Okay, this is the four-color theorem. Well, the four-color theorem asserts that any map can be colored with four colors only, and that with the property that no country neighboring another has the same color as this country. Did I explain that all right? So, for instance, you have only four colors, and you can notice that there is no country that is neighbor to another that has the same color. So this one is blue, so all the neighbors, none of the neighbors are blue. This one, when there is a contact by one point, it's not considered as a neighbor. And there is also the further constraint that countries are connected. So this is, I think, a theory that is very simple, but it took quite a long time to prove. The conjecture was formulated in 1852 by Francis Guthrie, and it took a quarter of a century at least for the first alleged proof to be given. It was by Kempe in 1879, and the proof consists in a proof by induction. So assume that a map with n country is four-colorable, that is, it has this property, then you have to prove that if you add a country, then it works out. So that's the proof by induction. And what we do is that we take a map with n plus one country, and we take a map with n country, we add a country, and we'll have to recolor the map so that it has the property. So if I add a country somewhere here, so it has a neighboring country, red, yellow, blue, and green, so I don't know which color to pick. So I have to do a recoloring. So this recoloring, in fact, that's the main part of the proof. You have to play with color, you have to recolor. So here is an example. You have 5 colors here, and then you have to switch the colors. So as to, you have to play with the colors so as to get something that is for colorable. So I talked about this proof by Kempe in 1879. Actually, it was proved a few years later that it didn't work, and that there was a lot of more work to do. And it's only in 1976 that the proof was given of the theorem. And the particularity of this proof is that it relies on computer power. So it cannot be proved without a computer. Well, I won't go into the details, but in fact the computer is used in 2 different ways. One way it is used is to find out a set of submaps that you will find in any map, whatever it is. So a finite set of submaps that you will find in every map. Well, you will find at least one member of this set into this map. And it must be finite. So for finding this set of unavoidable submaps, the computers were used as a heuristic. What I mean by that is that it is very difficult to find. It is impossible to find that a set of unavoidable configuration by one's own cognitive power. You have to rely on computer. But when you found the unavoidable set, you can prove it is unavoidable. So for the mathematician, he's relatively happy because the proof itself does not rely on computer power. So that's one use. It's a heuristic use of computer. The other use, however, is to prove that the submaps of this unavoidable set of submaps are reducible. That is, that you can use them so as to prove the four-color theorem. You can use them so as to do this game of replaying with the colors and having your theorem proved. Okay, so with this history of the four-color theorem, we have the construction of a distributed cognitive system. We have a history of the evolution of mathematical cognition. And in this history of the evolution of mathematical cognition, you have a change in how cognition is distributed. So here is the history with the nice computers and the mathematicians. So the proof of the four-color theorem is a case of distributed cognition. What do we have in order to show that it is really a case of distributed cognition? Well, first of all, we are trusting the output of the cognitive element. And here I have this joke. The computer wants to know whether lilac goes with pink. So it is not what the computer asked, but it conveys this idea that you have to trust the computer at some point. You don't want to check everything he says. You cannot. You have to trust it, and you have to interact very closely with it so as to perform the proof. But you don't want to do that with every cognitive element. What you need to do is to assess the reliability of the computer. Are you sure that the computer will implement the proof as you want it to do? And when you ask this question in the positive way, then you implement new practices. That is, programming, new practices of proving, which include programming and using computers. Okay, so in order to understand how distributed cognitive systems arise, one first thing is to understand why cognitive resources are given to solving a cognitive task. Well, as I told you, it took more than a century to prove the theorem, and I can calculate it that 10 million person hours have been devoted to solving the proof. So it is really incredible. There is also computer time, which in the 60s costed $1,000 per hour, and so most of the history of this proof has been to try to gain efficiencies, that is to spend less time to have better cognitive results. Why do we spend so much time on proving a theorem? One easy explanation is that it was famous. And why is it famous? Well, here I come up with cognitive factors, psychological factors that can account for an important cultural phenomenon. Well, one of the cultural factors is that it is easy to understand, it is easy to convey, and it is easy to start with playing with the colors. So when you start, you're somewhat grasped taken by the proof, and you want to go forward and forward. One of the reasons why one wants to go forward and forward is that it is a combinatorial problem. That is, combinatorial problems have these properties that well, going to the next step does not require so much cognitive effort. You just need to switch this color. It's easy. And you have also, always this expectancy that, well, if I change this color, then maybe it will be for colorable. I will get the result I want. So, using the cognitive principle of relevance, that asserts that the human cognitive system stands to allocate resources to the processing of available input according to their expected relevance, we can derive that the four-color theorem is given much cognitive resources. Okay. A second important thing that comes with the generation of distributed cognitive system is the production of these representations that are regulative representations, in the sense that they tell you you can use a computer in order to do a proof. Understanding why distributed cognitive systems evolve requires looking at the distribution of these specific regulative representations that ascribe cognitive functions to elements. So here I have many historical data about this question being raised and asked as to what we can do with a computer and how we can do that, and how do we have to use it. One specific thing that this discussion and representations show is that it goes against one understanding of distributed cognition. One understanding of distributed cognition is that, and situated cognition is that, if it is outside the mind, then it is not inside the mind. So cognition is kind of poured outside the mind, and then we don't need to think that much. With this historical study, and I think with other empirical study, we realize that in fact much cognition in the mind happens when we ask this question: how can I use these cognitive tools, and what can I do with them? The problem is raised in mathematics when in teaching at school, where students use their calculator, and as teachers may know, they don't use it properly, so it takes a lot of learning in order to use one's calculator, especially graphic calculator, properly. Okay. One of the points is that with this framework, we can begin to talk about institutions. Dansberger defined institutions as a distribution of a set of representations that include, in this set, representations that regulate the distribution itself. And it is what happened in distributed cognitive systems. We have this regulative representation. I can trust this computer for doing this and that. And this representation regulates how I will actually produce a proof and how I will manage with the proof. In the end, we get a feedback loop, because thinking about the distributed cognitive systems, that is, thinking about, well, let's take Haken, for instance. He's thinking about himself in interaction with a computer, what he does, how he does that. He has a view of a distributed cognitive system within which he thinks himself. And so this view of, it implies some kind of naive ontology. And in the case of the navigation system, where numerous people are involved, it also involved, I think, naive social ontology. With this representation, then distributed cognitive systems are maintained or changed. So here is the cultural cognitive causal chain involved in the maintenance and evolution of distributed cognitive systems. So distributed cognitive systems are characterized as cognitive causal chains that span distinct cognitive elements, people or cognitive tools, and that implement a cognitive function. Then they produce their cognitive output. They have a cognitive function, so they produce a cognitive output. There is the evaluation of the output. Is it satisfactory? Is it not satisfactory? And there is the production of regulative representation. Can I trust this computer? Why? And in which conditions? What do I have to do in order to produce my proof? That have an effect, a regulative effect, on the cognitive causal chain that constitutes distributed cognitive systems. Thank you.
Given what you said about distributed cognition, especially in respect to artifacts which are employed in distributed cognition, I wonder, could you push your argument further and say that those artifacts employed in distributed cognition are also kind of agent-like, that people are also attributing agency and sometimes anthropomorphize them in a distributed way of cognition processes?
Yes, there is, in fact, a process of anthropomorphizing. Well, in my case study, there was indeed a process of anthropomorphizing the computer, and in the sense that you attribute epistemic authority to something else, and you want to trust the artifact. However, there is some. There is also some philosophy talking about distributed cognitive systems and attributing agency. The philosophical questions about agency, and I did not raise these questions. I don't think you actually need to talk about the problem of agency. But there is, in fact, the people implicated do have these kind of representations. Sorry?
Is this written up?
Yes.
Is there written? I would love to have a copy. One point you made is that in these episodes of distributed cognition, there are emergent phenomena. That is, this group or process can either, there are some kinds of representational results that couldn't have happened inside an individual mind. And then you said two things that were contradictory. One, you gave the metaphor of one person can't carry a heavy thing and a whole bunch of people can, and that is just a matter of scale, right? But you said it's not just a matter of scale. And I guess what I completely agree with the point. And do you know the Lightman and Brower case study of the cosmic? Well, there's a history of science case study of a piece of conceptual change in cosmological theory, where they are addressing just that question, but it's not. It doesn't depend only upon external representations, but it's that parts of the theory were in the minds of different types of physicists who didn't necessarily really understand each other. You know, the people who do the descriptive work, the mathematical cosmologists, etc. And the question they're asking is, how does that collaborative process create a theory change? So you'll be interested in that case study. But anyway, so my question is, what do you mean by emergent phenomena that are not simply a matter of what can be achieved by scale? I mean, obviously the computer exceeds the computational ability of an individual mind, and that allows you to do something. But what other, I guess the question is, what's in general? Do you have something to say about the kinds of emergent properties that we get out of this?
Okay. I don't think that there is a kind of emergent property. I suppose that from case to case you get different emergent properties. What I have in mind with this case study, what is qualitatively different, I think, is in this case study is also the fact that even if one individual was living very, very, very long, he could not track down all the possibilities. One thing that, and I think that it also answers your question. One thing that is said by one of the mathematicians involved. Hold on, I will find a quotation. He says that the computer was much more, it's Apple, the computer was much more successful on checking reducibility, so the computer's task it has, because it was thinking not like a mathematician. So I think that it also...
You should please Susan and say there's another emergent property here, there's a conceptual change. The very notion of proof has been changed by this case of the formula. So that's a real conceptual change. The proof was something that you could follow mentally from step to step, and that what made it a proof. And now you have a notion where you delegate part of the steps to something that you cannot follow.
Okay. I should preface this remark by saying that I, for a long time, have recognized that there are a lot of very smart people who are fascinated by distributed cognition, and that makes me think that there's something important there that I just don't get. And maybe you can help me, because my concern is that the notion of distributed cognition is descriptive and not explanatory. And in particular, since you're framing this within the context of cultural evolution, let me flesh it out a little bit to show how the idea that cognition is distributed doesn't actually speak to the problem of evolution. So Hutchins describes two navigational systems, one of which he studied directly himself and the other which he uses the ethnographic record. The one that he studied himself is navigation on American warships, which has this cooperative framework that we described. Now, the reason that, from my perspective, calling that distributed cognition is an excellent description and a bad explanation with regard to cultural evolution is that it basically is just a case of sophisticated division of labor. That is, even if the particular sailors whose job it is to make one observation on this side of the ship and make another observation, and then they tell this to somebody whose job it is to write that down somewhere, and there's redundancy in case there's error in transmission and so on. Even if they're not exactly sure why they're doing what they're doing, it could easily be designed by a good captain, right, who understands the problem and understands how ships work. And that, in many ways, is no different than a hunter who organizes a party and says, right, okay, your job is to flush the rabbits, and your job is to hold the net, and your job is to beat the rabbits. And so, from the perspective of evolution, there's nothing puzzling about it in the sense that it's just another version of cooperation. But the other case that Hutchins describes, which is Micronesian navigation, is quite puzzling because Micronesian navigation involves a whole bunch of representations that are completely counterintuitive. There are islands that are invisible and they move. They're off the horizon somewhere. It's so complicated that despite having read his descriptions of it several times, I still can't really re-represent them. Right? And that strikes me as a very interesting instance of cultural evolution because if you don't have an architect, if you don't have a designer, a ship's captain who says, all right, your job is this and your job is this, then you have the Darwinian problem of how you get here from there, right? And it's completely unclear to me, what half a wing is with regard to Micronesian navigation. That is, what the intermediate steps are that get you to this wholly counterintuitive representation, of invisible islands that move and things like that. They're both distributed cognition, calling them that, effectively describes the phenomenon, but has no explanatory power with regard to the evolutionary problem.
Okay. Well, maybe you are being a little bit ethnocentric when you dismiss the Melanesian distributed cognitive system with regard to our distributed cognitive system. That's one first question.
Okay, there's something I don't get, right? I mean, I said that at the beginning, right?
So, in order to defend the theory of distributed cognition, I will emphasize the fact that they point out the function of the distributed cognition. So it is, in fact, it is actually descriptive, but it is also a functional description. And this functional description raises an important question. There is a design. So when you talked about the fact, well, some smart guy can pop in and say, you do that, you do this. It is not actually how it happens. There is a problem of evolution. And it is a problem of, it is really a problem, an interesting problem for cultural evolution, because we have the design. And my talk was to explain how we can come up through a cultural cognitive causal chain to a distributed cognitive systems that is well designed, that can actually perform its function, and with which we are satisfied.
I'm not sure I understand entirely, but perhaps other people may.
It's a very short one, just to support Christophe's point. In this silhouette navigation study referred to, there is actually some amount of division of labor, and there are quite complicated cognitive artifacts, such as charts. Well, they're written in sand, but nevertheless they constitute something of their cellular memory, and they also have these awfully complicated riddles and recitations that help them outsource the memory for the navigation. And the output, well, if you study it quite closely, is completely intuitive. Well, we can talk about that later, but I don't think the Puluwat case is a case against the existence of a very complicated division of labor, disputed cognition.
No, I didn't suggest that it was. What I suggested instead was that it doesn't look like a case of division of labor the way that navigation on American warships does.
Yes, it does.
I think you're being very unfair on Hutchins, because I mean Hutchins isn't just talking about the fact that these people have been put there, but that they are, I mean, as Olivier was saying, that they're using instruments which they have absolutely no idea how they work, but they're working on trust. And it seems to me that actually this is the bit which is missing, is the key element of being able to work on trust, that you're accepting other work on trust. And it's rather intriguing that the trust in the computer, if one's going to put you right at the heart of cultural evolution, the possibility of trusting other human beings, whether that can actually be going on via artifacts, which I think that's the core actually of Hutchins' argument.
Yep.
And then you see it's not very different from Micronesian.
Well, the importance of the Melanesian system is that it works. They do manage to go from one island to the other. So it has we can attribute a function to it, a cognitive function, and we can also say that it is well designed because it works.
No, but that wasn't my concern. My concern was that a good theory of evolution should explain how you can get the current adaptation from its predecessor.
But Christophe may well have precisely distributed cognition doesn't give you that. You've got to put it into a wider historical chain, but it characterizes problems from if you look at the evolution of culture. Namely, how you come to have this systematicity in distributed cognition systematic in such a manner that it does perform a function without typically having a designer. And nevertheless exhibiting designing properties. So now you have a problem for this sort of evolution of culture that, for instance, is not well addressed in simple mimetic terms or whatever, and where, so how do we do that? Maybe visual presentation or something else, but at least the problem is well posed by, clearly posed by the distributed cognition approach. I agree with you, it's descriptive, but describes an important problem that has not been properly addressed.
Can I agree with what you're saying, that there is one directionality which is kind of, in a sense, a little one-sided, is that I think that with the distributed historical distributed cognition evidence. What you get is this kind of externalized devices that into which you put epistemic trust in. So it's like you're distributing epistemic trust, and that's what it works. Now, there is an interesting kind of feedback effect. There's chap over here could tell better. The Hungarian philosopher Christophe Heintz was written a lot about how before writing, written record, testimony, and you probably know more about this than I do, the testimony and deference was kind of very, you just believed the testimony about the past. And when written record came along, which obviously had, we trusted that it was very useful, it must have been very useful to stabilize and be used for certain purposes, but one of the feedback effect was that there were different versions of the same historical events which didn't match. So that kind of was kind of the birth of critical thinking in his mind, that the idea that testimony, so it reduced our epistemic belief in the trustworthiness of testimony. But I suppose it can be fitted into the very same framework. But it's like giving us a new kind of, we discover something conceptual. For example, not being Cartesian these days is more, is easier to believe because we have we produce a lot of evidence about how our beliefs are how we, when we speak about the reasons of our behavior, we're actually retrospectively fitting stuff and we can be wrong. So we started not to believe in our first person authority, and in the same way we changed our cognition about ourselves through the help of these externalized devices.
Yeah, but one of the problems that, that's Woody repeated the same thesis, it actually is to be found in many places about the place of writing. It assumes an attitude towards writing which is rather similar to a sort of modern scientific one, while everything we know about how written records were actually considered as they were considered as beyond question. They never occurred to people to compare comparative ones. So you actually got to look at how they were actually used. And then, what you're describing is the potential that they have, which occurs actually with a particular development in the history of science. It's not the technology which did it.
I don't know the facts, so I can't.
No, this is
So then is signaling time. So I suppose what we should do is, first of all, thanks very much.